Welcome to Afterlife Experiences. If our content intrigues you, don't forget to show your support by giving this video a thumbs up and joining our community of subscribers. Now let's dive right into today's NDE experience. When I turned 16, I fell ill with a rare disease called pheochromocytoma, which is a type of tumor. It took the doctors a whole year to figure out what was wrong with me. During that time, I felt scared and confused because no one knew what was happening to my body. Finally, they decided to operate on me, hoping to save my life. On the day of the surgery, I was really nervous but also hopeful. They gave me anesthesia, and everything went black in an instant. But then something strange happened. It felt like I was floating in the air, right above the operating table. I was just hanging there, as if I had no weight, directly under the big, bright lamps. The room seemed huge, like I was in a giant cathedral with tall ceilings. Although I was only a couple of meters off the ground, it felt like I was high up, in some kind of magical space. I could see everything clearly. The doctors were moving around, and the air buzzed with energy. Soon the main surgeon, an older man with kind eyes, stepped into the room. He looked surprised and said, "Oh, the girl is already asleep," as if he wasn't expecting me to be out so quickly. But I wasn't really asleep. I was watching everything, floating silently above my own body. The room was bustling with doctors, nurses, and even students who had come to watch this rare operation. It felt strange to know that something so rare was happening to me. Only 1 or 2 people in my country get this disease each year, and without treatment, most of them don't survive. I realized how lucky I was to be there, surrounded by these experts. As I floated there, something changed. I no longer felt afraid. Instead, I felt a deep sense of calm and peace. All the fear and worry melted away, like I was being cradled by something warm and comforting. I looked down at the body on the table and knew it was mine, but it didn't feel like me anymore. It was like looking at an old machine, something I had borrowed for a while. My body had been my vessel, helping me live my life, but now I could see that it wasn't truly me. I was more than just my body. I started to understand that I wasn't just a girl lying there waiting for surgery. My true self was made up of many parts: my age, my appearance, my nationality. They were all just things I could leave behind. It was as if I had taken off a coat I didn't need anymore. My soul, the real me, was still floating above, safe and free. As I watched the doctors work, I could feel their emotions. Some of them were excited, some were nervous, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath. The tension in the room was thick, especially as the 3 main surgeons gathered around. The lead surgeon was an elderly professor, 67 years old. He had done a surgery like this only once before, many years ago, and no one else in the room had any experience with my rare condition. The room grew very quiet. Everyone was waiting for the first cut. I could feel their nervousness and fear mixed with a strange kind of excitement. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then, finally, the professor made the first incision, cutting through my skin. The tumor was located in my left adrenal gland, so they had to turn my body onto its side and tie it down. I watched as they carefully cut deeper and deeper into my tissues until they reached the gland. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. The surgeon stared at the gland for a moment, not touching it. There was a little bump on it, which they thought was the tumor. The plan was to remove it, but as they got closer, they realized something was wrong. The whole adrenal gland had turned into a tumor, and part of it was pushing through the surface. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Then at last the professor made his decision. He moved to cut the tumor. The moment his scalpel touched the gland, everything changed. It was as if time slowed down, like the world was holding its breath. Suddenly, the machines measuring my heart rate let out a loud, shrill sound. The energy in the room exploded. I could feel the panic ripple through everyone. They moved as if lightning had struck, each person doing their best to control the chaos. Time stretched and bent. It felt like a strange painting where people passed tools and moved in slow motion. At that moment, something powerful pulled me from behind, from where the lamps were. It was like a giant vacuum, and I couldn't resist it, no matter how hard I tried. In the same instant that I was pulled away, time snapped back into place. Everything sped up. The doctors were shouting, alarms were blaring, and panic filled the room. But it all happened so quickly, in less than a second. Suddenly, I was no longer in the operating room. I was flying through a dark tunnel, faster than I'd ever moved before. There were little flashes of light around me, and far ahead I could see a tiny yellow dot. It grew bigger and bigger until it was all I could see. It felt like I was being thrown out of the tunnel, like someone slides off the end of a water slide into a pool. When I landed, I was in a place I couldn't explain. There was no ground, no sky, and I wasn't flying, but I wasn't standing either. Everything around me was glowing a soft, milky yellow, like a thick fog lit by warm yellow lights. It was peaceful and beautiful. Then, 5 glowing figures appeared in front of me. They looked like people made of pure light, and one of them felt familiar. I knew she was a woman, even though I didn't know who she was. The others stood quietly, and I felt like they were there to help me understand what was happening. When I looked at her, I really wanted to see her face, but the more I tried, the less I could actually make out. It was like when you try too hard to focus on something and it slips away. Eventually, I stopped trying so hard, and that's when I could feel what her face was like. Almost like when you see things out of the corner of your eye without looking directly. It felt familiar and kind. There was this sense of warmth around them, like a big silent welcome. And although we weren't talking, we were sharing thoughts as easily as you speak with words. They took me to this strange place right in the middle of the glowing yellow mist. There were 3 perfectly round spheres, like glowing orbs, arranged in such a way that they formed a triangle. In the center of the triangle was a 4th sphere, much larger than the others, almost like it was watching over them. I asked what this place was, but I didn't hear an answer in words. Instead, I felt something change. At first, I wasn't sure what was different, but then I realized the yellow fog around us was starting to darken slowly, like a sunset turning to night. I felt like I was moving through the air, floating. The yellow faded into a deep blue, then into black, until suddenly I was surrounded by stars. The sky felt endless, and the beauty of it made me feel so small and yet so connected to everything. I knew that if I turned around, I would see the earth, and when I did, it was even more breathtaking than I had imagined. The earth was so close, almost like I could reach out and touch it. It looked alive, like a living, breathing creature full of energy and beauty. As I watched, I noticed small objects moving around the earth, hundreds of them. Some looked broken and ugly, like they were made of old, worn-out parts that didn't fit together quite right. Others were smooth, shining, and perfect, like they were made from the finest materials you could imagine. Inside those beautiful objects, there were beings living, and there were many different kinds, at least 3 or 4 types. They were all busy doing something important, but I didn't know what yet. Close to me, there was one of these devices, and inside were tall beings, about 2.5 to 3 meters high. They were watching me closely, but their gaze didn't feel threatening, just curious. I asked them, "Who are you?" And they answered, not with words, but with a thought that felt like a warm smile. "We are your friends." I was confused and asked, "What are you doing?" But before they could reply, they pointed toward the earth. I turned to look and saw a brilliant blue beam of light, almost like a laser, shooting through the vastness of space. It wasn't like a regular beam of light that goes on forever. This one had a clear start and end, like a train racing along its tracks. The beam hit the earth, passed through it, and then continued out into space. As soon as it touched the earth, the planet began to glow with a beautiful blue halo, and I felt like something big had just happened, something good. It was as if the whole earth had woken up, full of energy and excitement, like a beehive buzzing with life. The feelings of joy, peace, and enthusiasm spread from every living being on earth, and I could feel it all at once, like a wave of happiness washing over me. In that moment, I felt a pull, like gravity pulling me back toward the earth. I waved goodbye to the tall beings, and they smiled back. Though it wasn't the kind of smile you see, it was more a feeling of warmth and kindness. I flew toward the earth so quickly, it was both thrilling and a little strange. Before I knew it, I was back in the yellow fog, but I didn't fall or land like you might expect. I just floated, and the feeling of time was all mixed up, like it didn't matter here. The group was still there, watching over me from a distance. Suddenly, I noticed 2 boys, one about 7 years old and the other around 14, standing nearby. They seemed to be waiting for me. They welcomed me with open arms, and together they led me to another place, a new scene. This place was like a picture in the yellow fog, but when I stepped inside, everything felt real and alive. I found myself standing by the edge of a peaceful lake, surrounded by rolling hills. It was early autumn and the air was crisp. The three of us sat down by the shore, quietly watching the seasons change before our eyes. The leaves on the trees turned yellow, fell, and the wind began to blow. Soon, rain came, followed by thick fog that wrapped everything in a quiet blanket. The rain turned to snow, and the lake froze solid. The snow kept falling, covering everything in a deep, endless winter. It felt like the world was asleep for ages, locked in ice and silence. Then, after what seemed like years, tiny streams of water began to flow, and the ice on the lake cracked loudly, as though the earth itself was waking up. The sound was like nothing I had ever heard before, and it echoed in my mind. Spring arrived, and everything bloomed with life once more. The cycle continued. Summer came with its heat and buzzing insects, and soon, autumn returned. Even though I watched the seasons pass over and over, I couldn't quite understand why I was seeing this. But the boys seemed to know. They pointed to the far side of the lake, where a tall figure appeared, walking slowly toward us. He was like a giant, stooped slightly, but only about 1.8 meters tall. He led a horse pulling a cart, as if he had just returned from a long journey. He looked tired and deep in thought, his eyes fixed on the ground as he walked. And then, in a strange way, it felt like I became this man, seeing the world through his eyes. He had a small wife and 8 children, the youngest just a baby. He was poor, but among other peasants, he was considered middle class. He lived outside a city, and though life was hard, he did what he could to provide for his family. As I walked in his shoes, I saw the world through his tired, worn-out gaze. We reached a city, a gray, dirty place from the Middle Ages. The streets were narrow, covered in thick mud mixed with filth from both people and animals. Everywhere the sights and smells were overwhelming. Ragged children stared at me with wide eyes, and an old woman, toothless and dirty, shoved something foul in my face, trying to sell it. I pushed through the crowd until I reached the town square. In the middle of the square stood gallows, and a crowd of people had gathered to watch. 4 nooses hung from the gallows, and to my horror, I saw my own 14-year-old son standing there, one of the boys who had been with me by the lake. In that terrible moment, they were hanged. I let out a cry and ran toward him, but before I could reach him, a knight stabbed me in the heart, and I fell to the ground, dead. The scene shifted again, and I was no longer the man, but just an invisible observer. I watched as the crowd erupted in chaos, tearing down the barriers and rushing forward in fury. Among the crowd, I saw the man's wife, holding one of their younger children, a 7-year-old who looked so small and fragile. In the madness, someone took the boy from her arms, and a soldier, for no reason, drew his sword and struck the child down. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, I found myself back on the shore of the lake, shaken to my core. My mind was reeling from what I had just witnessed. Even though I didn't have a physical body, I felt myself trembling, crying uncontrollably. The boys, who had seen it all too, comforted me for a long time until I finally calmed down. When I regained my senses, they led me out of the strange place, and I was back in the yellow fog. The group was waiting for me, but something had changed. The yellow light disappeared, plunging everything into darkness. A deep fear washed over me, and I was terrified, not just for myself, but because I could see that even the beings in my group were scared. Everyone seemed frozen in panic. I started shouting, desperate for answers. "What's happening? What's going on?" But no one answered. They all just stared at me, their faces filled with fear. I knew in that moment something terrible was about to happen to me, something that would decide my fate.